Amid the silent oceans of stars where broken empires drifted like forgotten dreams, a single act of defiance would ignite the dawn of a new age. Orion Drax was no hero. He was a slave, an engineer, a survivor, and Empress Vialora. She was supposed to be his executioner, not his salvation. Yet fate and war had other plans. In a galaxy fractured by betrayal and blood trust, would become the rarest weapon, and love, the final rebellion. Fierce warrior queen crippled in battle, only the human slave she despised fought for her survival. The ambush came without warning. One moment, the draconian flagship Sovereign Eclipse cut through the void on a routine border patrol. The next it shuddered violently as enemy fire tore through its hull. Empress Vialora gripped the arms of her command chair, her scaled skin shimmering with iridescent blues and purples under the emergency lights. Her silver eyes narrowed as the tactical display showed 3 unidentified warships emerging from the nearby nebula. "Return fire target, their propulsion systems," she commanded, her voice carrying the natural resonance that had rallied armies across 12 star systems deep in the bowels of the ship. Orion Drax's hands moved with practiced precision over the engine control panel. The human engineer wiped sweat from his brow, fighting to maintain power to the weapon systems as damage reports flooded his terminal. 3 years of servitude had taught him the ship systems better than its designers. "Rerouting auxiliary power," he muttered, ignoring the wounded draconian technician moaning on the floor beside him. The ship lurched again, throwing him against the bulkhead. A gash opened above his eye, blood trickling down his face. The intercom crackled. "Engine room. We need more power to the shields." Orion Drax keyed the communication panel. "There is no more power. The antimatter containment field is already at critical levels. If we divert any more, you will do as commanded." "Human." The officer's voice cut him off by order of the Queen, clenching his jaw. Orion Drax's fingers hovered over the controls. He knew what would happen, what had to happen. The Queen's strategy would destroy them all. "No," he said firmly, initiating emergency protocols instead. "Cooling the reactor takes priority, or we all die." On the bridge, alarm screamed as another volley struck the flagship. Vialora felt the deck plate beneath her throne shudder ominously. "Your Majesty, the human slave in engineering has overridden your command," her first officer reported, reptilian features contorted with disgust. "What?" Vialora hissed, scales flaring with rage. "Override him." "I cannot. He's locked us out of the system." Before she could respond, the tactical officer turned. "Your Majesty, we're being pulled into the gravitational field of the uncharted planet. Without engine power, we cannot break free." Vialora rose to her full height, nearly 7 feet of lethal grace and fury. "Evacuate the ship, all hands to escape pods." As the bridge crew scrambled to obey, she keyed her personal communicator. "This is your Queen speaking. The human slave in engineering has sabotaged our ship. I order any loyal subject to execute him on sight." "In engineering." Orion. Drax heard the announcement with grim resignation. The ship was breaking apart around him. There was no time for escape pods. With methodical focus, he sealed the bulkheads of his section and braced for atmospheric entry. The massive ship screamed as it hit the upper atmosphere friction, turning its hull molten. Orion Drax strapped himself into an emergency harness as the artificial gravity failed. His last thought, before impact, was of the irony dying to save the Queen who had enslaved him. The world became chaos metal, tearing explosions blooming, and finally darkness. Consciousness returned to Orion Drax in waves of pain. He blinked, finding himself hanging upside down in his harness. Debris scattered everywhere. A fire burned somewhere nearby, filling the compartment with acrid smoke. With shaking hands, he released the buckle and fell awkwardly to what had once been the ceiling. His engineering training took over. Check for injuries. Cracked ribs, dislocated shoulder. Multiple lacerations, survivable. Check surroundings. Ship destroyed. Reactor offline, but stable. Check for survivors. None visible in engineering. Orion Drax forced open the warped door and stumbled through the wreckage. The ship had broken into 3 main sections across a valley of purple, huge vegetation. The bridge section lay half a kilometer away, partially embedded in a rocky outcropping. Logic told him to run, to use this opportunity to escape the Draconians forever. Yet something pulled him toward the bridge. Professional curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. The journey across the alien landscape took nearly an stellar cycle. Strange bird-like creatures circled overhead, their calls echoing unnaturally. The air was breathable but thick with unfamiliar spores that made his lungs burn when he reached the shattered bridge. Most of it was exposed to the elements. Bodies of Draconian officers lay scattered and broken. Orion Drax stepped carefully through the wreckage, checking for survivors despite himself. A weak groan drew him to a collapsed section of bulkhead. Beneath it, pinned and bloody, lay Empress Valora herself. Her silver eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with immediate recognition and hatred. "You!" she snarled, revealing sharp teeth. "You did this?" Orion Drax stood over her, taking in her broken form. Her lower body was crushed beneath twisted metal, dark purple blood pooling beneath her. "I saved what I could," he replied simply, "including your life." "It seems." Her clawed hand shot out with surprising speed, grasping his ankle. "Finish it. Then take your revenge, human." Orion Drax looked down at her, the fierce warrior queen now helpless before him. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter both their destinies. "No," he said, kneeling beside her. "I'm going to save you." Valora's silver eyes widened with disbelief. "Save me? You would mock your queen, even now." Orion Drax assessed the wreckage, pinning her lower body. The twisted metal had torn through her armored flight suit, revealing scales that shimmered between deep indigo and midnight black. Her royal insignia, a star cluster rendered in precious metals, lay shattered beside her. Not mocking surviving, he began clearing smaller debris. "And right now, that means getting you out of here before nightfall." The queen tried to move, then hissed sharply in pain. "I command you to find a working communicator instead. My fleet will send search parties. Your fleet thinks you're dead," Orion Drax replied, his voice devoid of emotion as he worked. "And if there were any communicators working, the emergency beacon would be active." The memory of their first encounter flashed unbidden in his mind. 3 years ago, he had stood before her throne, back straight, despite the neural restraints digging into his neck. He had been chief engineer of the human resistance vessel Defiance before its capture. "You designed the shielding array that destroyed 3 of my battle cruisers," she had stated. Not a question, but an accusation. "I designed a defensive system," he had corrected. "Your ships destroyed themselves, attacking it." The court had fallen silent at his insolence. Valora had risen from her throne, approaching with predatory grace. Up close, he had been struck by the intricate patterns in her scales, the intelligence in those silver eyes. The typical punishment, His execution, she had said, but wasting such technical knowledge would be inefficient. You will serve in my flagship's engineering section until your usefulness ends. The sound of metal groaning brought Orion Drax back to the present. He had managed to lift the smaller debris, but a massive support beam still trapped the Queen's lower body. I need leverage, he muttered, searching the wreckage. He found a broken piece of conduit that might serve as a makeshift pry bar. Vialora watched him with suspicion. Why help me? I enslaved you. I threatened your execution moments before the crash. Orion Drax positioned the conduit under the beam. Hold still. With a grunt of effort, he pushed down on the improvised lever. The beam shifted slightly. Vialora gave a sharp cry of pain, but didn't otherwise protest as he worked it free enough to slide her out. The sight of her injuries made his stomach clench. Her legs lay at unnatural angles, dark purple blood seeping from multiple lacerations. More concerning was her spine, a visible dent in the scaled ridges that suggested vertebral damage. "Can you feel your legs?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She glared at him. "Focus on getting us rescued." "Human Orion Drax," he corrected absently, checking her pulse points. "My name is Orion Drax, not human, and I am focusing on rescues yours at the moment." He fashioned a crude stretcher from debris and his own jacket. When he moved to lift her onto it, she bared her teeth. "I will crawl if necessary. You'll bleed out if you try." "Orion." Drax met her gaze directly. "Your choice, Your Majesty. Pride or survival." Something flickered in her silver eyes. Rage, then resignation. She gave a curt nod. With careful movements, he transferred her to the stretcher. She was lighter than he expected, her body dense with muscle rather than bulk. He tried to ignore the warmth of her scales against his skin, the strangely pleasant scent like amber and ozone that clung to her. "The rest of the ship is scattered across the valley," he explained, securing her with torn strips of fabric. "I'm gonna look for supplies before the sun sets." "How do you know when the sun sets here?" Orion Drax nodded toward the horizon, where the planet's orange-red sun was already dipping behind distant mountains. "We have maybe 2 stellar cycles." He dragged the stretcher to a relatively sheltered area under an outcropping of the strange purple-hued rocks. "I'll be back. Try not to attract anything's attention." As he picked his way through the wreckage field, Orion Drax questioned his own decision. The rational choice would be to leave her take whatever supplies he could find and put distance between himself and the wounded Queen. Freedom was literally a horizon away. Yet something deeper than reason drove him. Perhaps it was simply his own stubborn humanity, refusing to abandon even an enemy to a slow death. The midsection of the ship had fared worst in the crash, torn open like a gutted fish. Still, he managed to salvage a medical kit, emergency rations, a water purifier, and most precious of all, a portable energy cell. No working communicators as he'd expected. The light was fading fast when he returned. Vialora lay exactly as he'd left her, though her breathing seemed more labored. "Your Majesty," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes snapped open, pupils dilating in the dim light. "Report." Despite everything, Orion Drax smiled at the imperious tone. "No communicators. Basic supplies only. We're on our own." He set to work immediately using the medkit's diagnostic scanner on her injuries. The results confirmed his fears. Her spine was damaged at 2 points. Without proper medical facilities, she might never walk again. How bad, she asked, reading his expression. Bad enough. Your species has enhanced healing compared to humans, but some things are beyond simple recovery. He administered pain medication from the kit. This should help for now. As night descended, fully strange sounds emerged from the alien forest, edging the crash site. Howls and chittering calls that raised the hair on his arms. Orion Drax used debris to construct a rudimentary shelter around them, then activated the energy cell to power a small force field, not enough to last more than a night, but sufficient protection for now. In the soft blue glow of the field, he finally properly cleaned and dressed her wounds. Violora watched him work with an unreadable expression. "On my home world," she said. Suddenly, a warrior who cannot fight is considered already dead. Orion Drax's hands paused momentarily. "Good thing we're not on your home world. My sister will claim my throne when news of my disappearance reaches the capital." Her voice had lost its edge, becoming almost contemplative. Lysana. Vare has always believed humans should be exterminated rather than utilized. Your people will suffer under her rule. My people suffer under yours. Orion Drax replied evenly, finishing the bandaging. Violora's eyes drifted to the slave collar still circling his neck. Its control circuits fried in the crash. Yet here you are, tending to your oppressor's wounds. Here I am, he agreed, sitting back against the rock wall. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we'll see what kind of planet we're really dealing with. As the Queen's breathing eventually steadied in sleep, Orion Drax stared out at the alien landscape bathed in the light of 3 small moons. Beyond their fragile shelter, something large moved through the underbrush. He tightened his grip on a jagged piece of metal he'd fashioned into a makeshift weapon. Freedom had been within his grasp. Now he was trapped again. Not by a slave collar, but by his own choice. A decision that might get him killed, or might change everything. Dawn broke with brutal intensity, twin suns cresting the horizon and immediately baking the crash site. Orion Drax woke drenched in sweat, his makeshift shelter already in oven. The temperature rose 20 degrees in quantum ticks, he said, checking on Violora. Her scaled skin had taken on a dry, dull appearance. Your species doesn't handle heat well. We thermoregulate through our scales, she replied, voice raspy without sufficient moisture. Orion Drax immediately reached for the water purifier. The ship's coolant system might have surviving reservoirs. I'll check after you drink. He held the container to her lips, struck by the strange intimacy of the gesture. Violora seemed to feel it too, her silver eyes watching him intently as she drank. The valley transformed under the harsh orbital rotation light. What had seemed like purple vegetation now revealed itself as crystalline growths that fractured sunlight into prismatic patterns. Beautiful, but offering no shelter. I need to build something better than this, Orion Drax said, surveying their meager camp. The temperature swings could kill us both. Violora watched him gather materials from the wreckage. In 3 years of service, you never spoke this much. In 3 years of service, you never listened, he countered, dragging a large section of hull plating back to camp. By mid-orbital rotation, Orion Drax had constructed a more substantial shelter, angling reflective panels to deflect the worst of the heat. Inside, he created a space just large enough for 2, with Violora's makeshift bed, elevated to prevent ground predators from reaching her easily. The first predator arrived at dusk. Orion Drax had been collecting liquid from condensation traps when he heard the low vibrating growl The creature resembled a massive feline, but with 6 limbs and translucent skin that revealed pulsing organs beneath. Its jaws could easily engulf his head. He backed slowly toward camp, the predator stalking each step 20 meters from safety. It charged. Orion Drax sprinted, diving through the shelter entrance as the creature slammed against the hull plating. The impact sent Vialora's bed sliding, and she gave a rare cry of pain. "We need weapons," she hissed through clenched teeth as the predator circled their shelter. Already on it, Orion Drax pulled out a crude spear fashioned from ship components. I salvaged some of the ship's electrical systems, too. Working quickly, he connected the spear tip to their power cell, creating a makeshift electrical weapon. When the predator thrust its head through the entrance, Orion Drax drove the electrified spear into its shoulder. The creature's shriek was deafening. It retreated, leaving them in momentary peace. In the quiet aftermath, Vialora studied him. "You've survived hostile environments before. The mining colonies where I grew up weren't exactly paradise," Orion Drax replied, checking his trap configuration and the Resistance taught survival skills. "The Resistance," she repeated, "your designs killed thousands of my people. Your invasion killed millions of mine." He shot back, "including my family." An uncomfortable silence fell between them as night deepened. The temperature plummeted their breath, forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "We should conserve body heat," Orion Drax said pragmatically. Vialora's expression remained unreadable, but she shifted slightly on her bed. "If we must." Orion Drax hesitated, then lay beside her, careful not to disturb her injuries. The warmth of her scales surprised him. A dry heat. "Like sun-baked stones, your heart beats quickly." She observed, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Survival instinct." He murmured, hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched. Outside, something large moved in the darkness. Inside, a different kind of tension built between predator and prey, though which was which, had suddenly become less clear. A solar revolution passed in the grueling rhythm of survival. Orion Drax spent his orbital rotations, scavenging, improving their shelter, and setting up defensive perimeters. Nights were occupied by necessary closeness as the temperature dropped to near freezing. "I need to check the bridge section again," Orion Drax said, adjusting Vialora's position. Her wound dressings needed changing less frequently. Now her species' remarkable healing evident despite the severity of her injuries. If any communication equipment survived, it would be there. "Take my sidearm," she said, gesturing to the stellar conduit blaster he'd recovered, but left untouched. "It has 3 charges remaining." Orion Drax hesitated. "You're giving me a weapon." "I'm prioritizing our survival," she replied, though something in her expression had softened over the orbital rotations. "Besides, you've had numerous opportunities to kill me." The crashed bridge section looked different in orbital rotation, light less imposing and more forlorn. Orion Drax picked through the wreckage, methodically searching for anything salvageable. In what remained of the command console, he found a partial communications array. Not enough to send a distress signal to the Empire, but perhaps sufficient to create a planetary beacon if he could boost the signal. As he disconnected the components, something caught his eye, a data crystal embedded in the security panel. Curious, he extracted it and slipped it into his pocket for later examination. The journey back was tense. He sensed eyes watching him, though the crystalline forest remained eerily still. He arrived at their shelter just as darkness fell. The protective measures he'd established, keeping predators at bay, Veilora looked up as he entered, her expression unguarded. "For once you returned," I said. "I would." He presented his findings, explaining the communication possibilities while omitting mention of the data crystal. That night, as they huddled together against the cold, Veilora spoke about her homeworld, a planet of vast oceans and floating cities. For the first time, she asked about his Earth. Was beautiful once, he told her. Before the invasions, we had forests, real ones with trees and animals, cities that stretched to the horizon. You speak as though all humans lived in harmony, she observed. Orion Drax laughed softly. Hardly. We fought each other constantly over resources, ideology, territory, but it was our fight to have. Is that why you became a resistance engineer? For freedom, for survival? At first, he admitted, then for justice. Their conversation lulled into comfortable silence. Orion Drax became acutely aware of her scales against his skin, smoother than they appeared, radiating pleasant warmth. "What happens if we're never rescued?" she asked suddenly. Before he could answer, something large struck their shelter, rocking it violently. Orion Drax grabbed the stellar conduit blaster as a section of hull plating gave way. The creature that burst through was smaller than their previous visitor, but more agile, with razor-like appendages and multiple eyes. It lunged directly for Veilora, sensing the wounded prey. Without hesitation, Orion Drax threw himself between them, firing the pistol. The creature reeled back, wounded, but not defeated. It circled, preparing another attack. "Get behind me," Orion Drax ordered, abandoning all protocol. To his surprise, Veilora dragged herself into position, pressing her back against his left side. She warned sharply. Working in unexpected synchrony, they tracked the creature's movements. When it attacked again, Orion Drax fired his second shot, guided by Veilora's tactical instinct. The creature collapsed, its strange phosphorescent blood pooling beneath it. In the aftermath, still pressed together, Orion Drax felt Veilora's hand close around his wrist. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," he answered honestly later. While Veilora slept, Orion Drax examined the data crystal. What he discovered sent ice through his veins. The ship's final sensor logs showed their attackers had used draconian security codes to approach undetected. The ambush hadn't been a random attack. It had been an assassination attempt from within the Empire itself. It was Lysana. Veilora said flatly when Orion Drax revealed his discovery. Her silver eyes had gone cold, reflecting nothing. "My own sister. You don't seem surprised," Orion Drax noted, watching her closely. "Surprised, no. Disappointed that she finally acted. Perhaps Veilora's claws dug into the bedding beneath her. Power transitions in the Draconian Empire are rarely peaceful." Rain pounded against their shelter, the first precipitation they'd encountered on this strange planet. What had begun as a light shower quickly intensified into a deluge that threatened to flood their camp. "We need higher ground," Orion Drax said, already gathering their meager supplies. "Can you?" "I can't walk," she snapped, frustration evident in the way her scales darkened. "I'm useless to you." "Orion." Drax knelt beside her. "You're not useless. Your knowledge kept us alive this long, with careful movements. He lifted her one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. "Hold on to me." Their eyes met mere inches apart. Something unspoken passed between them, a current stronger than the rising waters outside. Violora wrapped her arms around his neck, her strength still impressive, despite her injuries. "Don't drop your queen, human." "Wouldn't dream of it," he replied, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. The journey to higher ground was arduous. The rain made every surface treacherous, and twice they nearly fell. By the time they reached a rocky outcropping with a shallow cave, both were exhausted. The cave barely accommodated them, forcing a proximity that couldn't be avoided. Their bodies pressed together, Orion Drax's back against stone. Violora partially across his chest. Violora was quiet so long he thought she might not answer. She was always the perfect draconian, she finally said. Unflinching, merciless, efficient. I was different. Different how I questioned. I wondered if domination was truly the only path to security. Her voice lowered. I reduced the execution rate of captured resistance fighters by 60% during my reign. Orion Drax absorbed this revelation. Is that why I was spared? Perhaps her claws traced unconscious patterns against his chest. Or perhaps I saw something in you, that orbital rotation, a reflection. The rain intensified, drumming against the rocks outside their small sanctuary. Water seeped in, soaking them further. "What will you do if we return?" Orion Drax asked when he corrected himself. "Reclaim my throne, execute Vexera for treason." Her answer came without hesitation. "And the humans, the slaves?" Violora's eyes found his in the dimness. "What would you have me do?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Before he could answer, thunder cracked directly overhead, making the ground beneath them tremble. "I never thought I'd die like this," she whispered. Broken, dependent. Orion Drax's arm tightened around her reflexively. "You're not dying. In my culture, this," she gestured to her useless legs, "is worse than death. A warrior should fall in battle, not linger in half-life. In my culture," Orion Drax countered, "we believe in second chances, in transformation." Their faces were perilously close now, breath mingling in the cool, damp air. Violora's scales had taken on a luminescent quality in the darkness, highlighting the elegant sweep of her features. Transformation. She repeated the word, barely audible over the storm. Her hand moved to his face, tracing the line of his jaw with surprising gentleness. Orion Drax remained perfectly still, caught between instinct and reason. "You have been many things to me." "Orion Drax," she said, his name sounding strange and intimate on her tongue. Prisoner servant, savior. And now he asked, voice rough. Instead of answering, she closed the distance between them. Her lips were warmer than he expected, softer. The brief contact, sending electricity through his body that had nothing to do with species differences. When she pulled back, the look in her silver eyes held both wonder and terror at her own action. Outside, the storm continued unabated, matching the tempest, suddenly raging in Orion Drax's heart. Morning revealed a transformed landscape. The crystalline forest glittered with raindrops, and new growth had already emerged from the suddenly fertile ground. Orion Drax ventured from their cave to survey the area, grateful for the distraction from the lingering memory of Violora's kiss. Near the cave entrance, he discovered a cluster of unusual plants with translucent blue leaves. They reminded him of medicinal flora from Earth's rainforests. On impulse, he collected several samples. "What are those?" Veilora asked when he returned, her tone carefully neutral, as though the previous night hadn't happened. "I'm not sure, but they have a structure similar to plants with anti-inflammatory properties on Earth." He knelt beside her. "May I?" After her nod, he crushed the leaves, releasing a sweet-smelling sap. "This might help with your spinal inflammation. It could reduce pressure on your neural pathways." "Tea. You have medical training?" she asked as he applied the paste to her injuries. "Engineering encompasses many disciplines," he replied. His fingers worked with precision, tracing the curve of her spine, including biomechanics. Veilora shivered at his touch. "The Empire underestimated your species' adaptability. A common mistake." His hands lingered longer than necessary. "You should rest now." In the orbital rotations that followed, Orion Drax established a routine: mornings for gathering food and medicinal plants, afternoons for working on the communication beacon, evenings for Veilora's treatments. Neither mentioned the kiss, though it hung between them, altering the gravity of their interactions. On the 7th orbital rotation, Veilora gasped during her treatment. "What is it?" Orion Drax asked, immediately concerned. I felt that she said, disbelief evident in her voice. "Your hand on my leg, I felt it." Orion Drax's heart raced. "Can you move your toes?" She concentrated, face tense with effort, slowly, barely perceptible. Her foot twitched. "It's working," he breathed, looking up to find her eyes shining with emotion. "The treatment is working." Without thinking, he took her hand, squeezing it in shared triumph. She didn't pull away. That night, their shelter felt charged with new energy. Orion Drax worked on the beacon with renewed determination, while Veilora attempted small movements with her recovering limbs. "I've been thinking about what you asked," she said suddenly, "about the humans if we return." Orion Drax set down his tools. "My father believed that true strength came from incorporation, not annihilation. He conquered, yes, but he also assimilated." Her eyes met his. "Perhaps there is a better way than slavery or extinction." "Alliance," Orion Drax suggested. "Partnership." The Council would resist. Then they would need to be convinced. He moved closer, drawn by an invisible pull. Or replaced. Veilora reached for him, her touch deliberate this time. "You would help me shape a new empire. I would help you build a better future," he corrected, closing the distance between them. This kiss was different, deliberate, exploratory. Her scales were smooth beneath his palms as he cradled her face. She pulled him closer with surprising strength, deepening the contact. When they separated, both slightly breathless, Orion Drax rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates things." "Everything worthwhile is complicated," she replied, her claws gently scraping along his back, sending shivers down his spine. The beacon's light suddenly flashed, drawing their attention. "It's working." "Orion," Drax said, moving reluctantly to check the device, transmitting on all emergency frequencies. "How long until someone might hear it?" "Ours orbital rotations depends on who's listening." Veilora's expression grew serious. "If Lysana Vare's forces find us first, then we'll be ready," Orion Drax assured her, though the makeshift weapons he'd assembled seemed woefully inadequate against trained soldiers that night. They held each other with new awareness. The barriers between queen and slave, predator and prey completely dissolve. Outside, the planet's 3 moons aligned in rare conjunction, casting their shelter in silver light that matched Veilora's eyes as they reflected Orion Drax's gaze. with equal parts wonder and desire. The healing had begun not just of her body, but of something much deeper between them. The ship appeared on the horizon 3 orbital rotations later, a sleek draconian scout vessel descending through the atmosphere with predatory grace. Not a rescue team, Veilora observed grimly from the cave entrance. Her posture tense despite the walking staff Orion Drax had fashioned for her. Her recovery had progressed rapidly, though she still couldn't manage more than a few steps without support. Lysana Vare's hunters, Orion Drax, studied the ship through a makeshift scope. 6 soldiers, heavily armed. They're tracking the beacon. Deactivated, she ordered, her voice slipping into royal command before softening. Please. They worked quickly, gathering only essential supplies. Veilora strapped the stellar conduit blaster to her thigh, its final charge preserved for desperate circumstances. Orion Drax concealed various improvised weapons across his body, including a particularly lethal blade fashioned from the ship's hull material. The caves extend deeper into the mountain, he said, supporting her as they moved away from the entrance. We can lose them in the tunnel system. Progress was slow and painful. Veilora refused to show weakness, but Orion Drax felt each suppressed wince as they navigated the rough terrain. The tunnels narrowed, forcing them to crawl in sections. Behind them, distant shouts echoed as the hunters discovered their abandoned shelter. They'll follow our trail, Veilora whispered as they paused in a small chamber deep within the mountain. Luminous. Scent. Fungi provided dim blue light, casting her scales in ethereal patterns. I'm slowing you down. Orion Drax cupped her face. We do this together, or not at all. Her eyes softened. When did you become so loyal to your queen? Not to my queen, he corrected, brushing his thumb across her cheek. To you. The distant sound of footsteps broke the moment. They pressed deeper into the cave system, eventually emerging into a vast underground cavern. A subterranean lake spread before them, its black waters perfectly still, reflecting the crystalline formations hanging from the ceiling. We need to cross, Orion Drax said, eyeing the narrow ledge circling the perimeter. Stay close to the wall. The ledge was treacherous, barely wide enough for single-file movement. Halfway around, Veilora stumbled, nearly falling into the dark waters. Orion Drax caught her, pulling her firmly against him. I've got you, he murmured against her ear. The intimacy of the position sent heat through both of them despite the danger. For a breathless moment, they remained entwined, hearts racing in tandem. Movement ahead. Veilora whispered suddenly, her superior vision catching what Orion Drax couldn't yet see. They pressed into a shadowed alcove as 2 soldiers approached from the opposite direction. The hunters moved with professional precision, weapons ready, nowhere to run now, one said in the harsh, draconian language. Orion Drax felt Veilora tense against him, preparing to fight, despite her condition. He squeezed her hand, a silent signal. She nodded almost imperceptibly. As the soldiers passed their hiding place, Orion Drax struck. His makeshift blade found the first soldier's throat, while Veilora, with surprising speed, tripped the second with her staff. The soldier tumbled into the lake with a startled cry. The water erupted. Something massive surged upward, dragging the thrashing soldier beneath the surface. Blood spread in dark clouds as the unseen predator fed. The others will have heard Orion Drax said, collecting the fallen soldier's weapon. This way, Veilora pointed toward a tunnel barely visible behind some crystal formations. I can smell fresh air. The tunnel ascended steeply, challenging Veilora's recovering strength. Orion Drax supported her without comment. understanding her pride too well to offer unnecessary help. When she finally stumbled, he caught her against his chest, their faces aligned perfectly, breaths mingling in the confined space. Despite everything, the pursuing hunters, the alien environment, the odds against them. Orion Drax felt an overwhelming urge to kiss her again. Vialora made the decision for him, pressing her lips to his with fierce urgency. The kiss was hungry, desperate, possibly their last. "If we don't survive this," she whispered against his mouth, "know that you have changed everything." Orion Drax deepened the kiss, his hands sliding down her body with newfound boldness. "We're going to survive, and then we're going to change everything else." The sound of pursuit grew louder, forcing them apart. They continued upward, emerging onto a high ridge overlooking the valley. Below, the remaining hunters spread out in search patterns. Above, the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon. "We make our stand here," Vialora said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Together." Orion Drax nodded, the stolen draconian weapon heavy in his hands, former slave and wounded queen. They prepared to face their hunters as equals, united by something neither had expected to find in this hostile world. They survived the night through strategy rather than strength. Orion Drax's traps claimed 2 more hunters, while the planet's indigenous predators dealt with another, drawn by their carefully staged distractions. By dawn, only 1 hunter remained more cautious than his fallen comrades. "He's calling for reinforcements," Vialora said, intercepting transmissions with the stolen communicator. "We have perhaps 3 orbital rotations before a larger team arrives." Orion Drax adjusted the support brace he'd constructed for her back using salvaged armor plates. "Then we have 3 orbital rotations to prepare. How's this feel?" Vialora stood testing her balance. The brace provided stability. Her healing spine still couldn't manage alone. "Better with this. I might even fight." "Let's focus on getting you mobile first," he suggested. Hands lingering on her waist, "Walk to me." She took her first unaided steps in nearly 2 solar revolutions, each movement deliberate and controlled. When she reached him, her triumph shone in her silver eyes. Orion Drax couldn't resist pulling her into an embrace. "Engineering encompasses many disciplines," she quoted back at him, her tone teasing despite their dire circumstances. "Including structural support for stubborn queens," he replied, earning a throaty laugh that sent pleasant shivers down his spine. They established a new base in a defensible position with multiple escape routes. A lesson learned from their previous encounter, Orion Drax began constructing more sophisticated weapons while Vialora developed their tactical plan. "Your engineering skills are remarkable," she observed, watching him modify the dead soldier's weapons. "In another life you might have been a weapons master on my home world. In another life we might never have met," he pointed out. Her expression grew thoughtful. "Do you regret that? Meeting me as a slave rather than an equal?" Orion Drax set down his tools. "I regret the circumstances, not the outcome." He moved to her side, taking her hand. "Though I'm not sure Vexera deserves my gratitude for the assassination attempt. When I reclaim my throne, she'll regret it far more." Vialora promised, her claws extending reflexively. Throughout the orbital rotation, Vialora practiced walking, gradually rebuilding her strength. By evening, she could manage the perimeter of their shelter without assistance. Her natural draconian healing, accelerated by Orion Drax's plant treatments, was performing what would have been impossible for a human spine. As twilight fell, they intercepted another transmission from the remaining hunter. They found the scout ship. Orion Drax translated his command of the Draconian language, still imperfect. Something about usurper protocol. Vealora's expression darkened. Vexara has officially claimed the throne. She's declared me dead. Is that good or bad for us? Both the search may become less urgent, but if we're captured, she didn't need to finish the thought. That night, their physical therapy session evolved into something more intimate. What began as Orion Drax massaging tension torn from her healing muscles shifted when Vealora pulled him forward, claiming his mouth with increasing confidence. "Are you sure?" he asked as her claws expertly unfastened his clothing. Her reply was to guide his hands to the clasps of her armor. "I have never been more certain of anything." They came together with the intensity of survivors, each touch a defiance of death and separation. Their differences in physiology created unexpected pleasures as they explored each other's bodies with equal parts curiosity and desire. Vealora's scales heightened sensitivity where they brushed against his skin, while her strength, even diminished, thrilled him. Afterward, lying entwined in their makeshift bed, Orion Drax traced patterns along the iridescent scales of her shoulder. "What happens if we make it back?" When she corrected, echoing his earlier optimism. "And when we do everything changes. Your people won't accept this," he said, gesturing to their intimate position. "They won't have a choice." Her expression grew serious. "The Empire has stagnated under traditions that no longer serve us. Perhaps this us is the catalyst for evolution." Dawn brought renewed purpose. Vealora continued her physical conditioning, while Orion Drax completed work on their modified weapons. By mid-orbital rotation, she could move with almost her former grace, though extended exertion still caused pain. "We need to capture that ship," she said as they finalized their plan. "It's our only way off this planet." "Orion." Drax nodded, loading the last of their improvised explosives. "One hunter against the two of us." "I like those odds." She pulled him close, pressing her forehead to his, a draconian gesture of deep connection. "We are more than queen and slave now, more than survivors. Partners," he suggested. Her smile revealed the elegant danger of her predator's teeth in everything. Their plan unraveled the moment they spotted not one, but 4 draconian soldiers guarding the scout ship. Reinforcements had arrived early. "Vexara must have traced the transmission," Vealora whispered from their observation point. "These are her personal guard. I recognize the insignia." Orion Drax studied the heavily armed soldiers through his scope. "We need a new approach. We need a diversion." Vealora's expression hardened with decision. "I'll draw them away. You take the ship." "Absolutely not," he replied instantly. "We're not separating. This isn't a debate, Orion Drax. It's tactics." Her voice softened as she touched his face. "I can outmaneuver them in the crystal forest, even in my condition. They won't expect their dead queen to be the bait." Before he could protest further, the wind shifted. One of the soldiers raised his head, nostrils flaring. They had caught their scent. Too late for planning. Vealora said, pushing Orion Drax toward the densest part of the forest. "Run." They fled, as energy weapons scorched the ground behind them. Vealora moved with surprising speed. Despite her healing injuries, her evolutionary advantages evident in her ability to navigate the difficult terrain, Orion Drax kept pace, adrenaline sharpening his senses. The first trap they'd set orbital rotations earlier caught one soldier unprepared. The ground collapsed beneath him, sending him plummeting into a pit of crystalline spikes. His scream cut off abruptly. 3 left. Orion. Drax counted as they continued running. They separated at a forked path, executing their contingency plan without needing to speak. 2 soldiers followed Veilora, while 1 pursued Orion Drax's perfect division. Orion Drax led his pursuer toward the second trap, a tripwire connected to explosives fashioned from the ship's fuel cells. The blast shook the forest crystal shards, raining down like lethal rain. No time to confirm the kill. He circled back toward Velora's position, heart pounding with more than exertion. The sound of energy weapons echoed through the crystalline formations. He found her engaged in direct combat with 1 soldier, her movements fluid despite her recent paralysis. The other soldier lay motionless nearby, neck at an unnatural angle. Orion Drax raised his stolen weapon to assist, but Velora had already gained the upper hand. With a precise strike to the throat, she dispatched her opponent. For a moment, she stood over the fallen soldier chest, heaving scales shifting through colors that reflected her heightened emotional state. Orion Drax had never seen anything more beautiful or terrifying. "The ship," she said, straightening with imperial dignity, despite the violence just enacted. Now they approached cautiously alert for additional guards. The scout vessel sat undisturbed in the small clearing. Its sleek design, a stark contrast to the crystalline wilderness surrounding it. "Can you fly it?" Veilora asked as they entered through the rear hatch. "It's not unlike systems I've worked with." Orion Drax replied, examining the controls. "Basic principles apply across species. Propulsion is propulsion." As he initiated the pre-flight sequence, an alarm blared. The forward screen activated, revealing a face similar to Veilora's but with scales and shades of emerald rather than indigo. Her eyes widened in apparent shock. Sister Vexara hissed, recovering quickly. "The reports of your death were clearly exaggerated, as will be reports of my defeat," Veilora replied coldly. "You've committed treason against your queen." Vexara's laugh was harsh. "I am queen now. The succession has been formalized. Your return would only bring civil war." "Then civil war comes," Veilora promised. Vexara's gaze shifted to Orion Drax. "And you bring your pet human to challenge me. How far you've fallen, sister." "Fallen." Veilora spat, her voice low and edged with pain, yet fierce determination. "I rise where you have sunk into tyranny, Vexara." A brief charged silence followed before Vexara barked. "Guards, elite, detachment now." From behind the shattered crystalline bows, a small team of sleek armored figures emerged, their voices clipped and authoritative. Queen Vexara, awaiting orders. Orion Drax gripped the hilt of his salvaged weapon and exchanged a look with Veilora. "I suppose we're doing this the hard way," he murmured. Veilora's reply was sharp. "No time for regrets. Use my traps, Orion Drax. They know no mercy." In a flurry of dialogue punctuated by the clatter of falling debris and sizzling circuitry, Orion Drax directed left flank, trigger, trap alpha, now, a hidden conduit, wind. As the ground gave way beneath one approaching guard, one of the elites sneered as he fell. "What treachery is this? Your own queen's miscalculation, apparently," Vexara retorted, though her tone betrayed a grudging respect for Veilora's defiance. Amid the chaos, Veilora's tactical mind shone through Orion. "Drax, adjust the frequency on the improvised disruptor. Cut their comms off on it." Orion Drax answered briskly, his fingers dancing over a panel he'd rigged from scavenged circuitry. With a surge of static and a flicker of light, the elite guard's radio sputtered silent. One guard, eyes wide with disbelief, shouted communications offline, fall back. But orders from Vexara cut his retreat short. Stand your ground for the throne. The ensuing melee was punctuated with desperate dialogue. Keep them off my queen. Vialora roared as she vaulted over a shattered support beam, her voice blending command with raw emotion. Queen, the trap in Corridor B. Activate it. Orion Drax called maneuvering amid the skirmish. A secondary trap, a net woven from energy. Conductive filaments descended onto another group of guards, ensnaring them in a pulsating grip. As the last of Vexara's elite fell or fled, a sudden tense silence filled the clearing. Vialora, blood and rain mingling on her scales, turned to Orion Drax. We have captured their scout vessel. Orion Drax frowned, surveying the small craft with a critical eye. It's intact, but it's tiny. It can transport only one person. At these words, voices lowered and hearts pounded as both leaders faced the inevitable dilemma. Who will go? Demanded one of the remaining soldiers, his tone laced with incredulity, even as he lay wounded. Vialora's eyes met Orion Drax steadily. I cannot leave my throne, my people or my allies behind, she stated, her voice soft yet resolute. I must stay to reclaim what is rightfully mine. But I, Orion, Drax began the weight of his own survival and their shared past, evident in every syllable. Vialora interrupted, her tone gentle yet unwavering. No, Orion. Drax, you have already risked everything for me. I trust you to prove to the Empire the truth of our cause. Take my royal insignia. Let it be your bond at court and your right to lead. Orion Drax's eyes glimmered with conflicted emotion as he reached out. You're asking me to become not just your savior in battle, but your ambassador of hope. Exactly, she whispered. Infiltrate the palace, rally those still loyal to our vision and secure our future. I will stay behind to guide our people from within, even as I heal. A quiet pause allowed the gravity of her words to settle between them. Then I shall carry your emblem with honor, my queen. Orion Drax vowed carefully, fastening the gleaming insignia to his tunic. I promise you, our people will know the truth, and Vexara will fall for her treason. A distant commotion echoed, and Vexara's sneer returned as she spat. Your naive hope will be your undoing. Vialora's retort was icy calm. The Empire is ready for change. Sister and Orion Drax will be the spark that ignites our return to power. Later, hidden beneath the fractured arches of a forgotten corridor in the underground recesses of the palace, Orion Drax convened with a cadre of disillusioned officers and sympathetic aristocrats. Listen well, he urged in a hushed tone. Vialora's claim is true. Vexara's rule is built on fear and betrayal. Our loyalty must be to justice, not tyranny. A skeptical noble questioned. And what of the humans? Do we dare ally with a slave? Orion Drax's reply was firm. Humans are survivors, innovators. They will no longer be despised. They will be valued as partners in a new era. I have seen firsthand the merit in every life. Across the Empire, murmurs of dissent grew louder. In clandestine meetings, former palace guards and council members whispered, "The queen who was declared dead returns, and with her hope." At last, the decisive moment arrived. Under cover of darkness, aided by Orion Drax's newly forged alliances, a daring rescue mission was launched. Vialora weakened, but unbowed was spirited away from her confinement in a coup orchestrated by loyalists. In the Grand Throne Room, now reclaimed from Vexara's oppressive forces, Vialora stood before the gathered assembly. With a voice both tender and triumphant, she declared torbital rotation. I reclaim not just my throne, but the promise of a just empire. I name Orion Drax as my savior and consort, whose courage has mended the rift between our peoples. A stunned silence was quickly replaced by resounding cheers. Long live Empress Vialora, one exalted, while another added, long live the alliance of strength and compassion. Vexara, exposed and defeated, was seized by the very officers who had once obeyed her. For treason they cried, as she was led away. Her reign ended by the very revolution she had incited. As the assembly's fervor swelled, Vialora stepped toward Orion Drax, her eyes soft yet resolute. "We will reshape the Empire," she murmured. "No longer will humans be shackled by prejudice. Together we will foster a new era of equality and innovation." Orion Drax's reply was gentle, his tone imbued with hope. "Then let our union be the cornerstone of this new world, where our strengths unite and our differences become our greatest asset." In that charged moment, amid the echoes of rebellion and the promise of reform, the Empire began its long overdue transformation. A future where the bonds between queen and consort, warrior and engineer would forever alter the course of history.